What's up guys, Asian here, and this is another video kind of covering core game mechanics and common misconceptions that new players might have in ESO. So, today we're going to be talking about this idea of the law of diminishing returns. Those of you guys who have looked at recent uploads might notice that I reacted to a Mystic Raven's reaction to a build video, and he's one of those people who really pushes this sort of law of diminishing returns being a thing in ESO, and I'm here to basically say that he's wrong, essentially. He might be confusing a completely different property for diminishing returns. So I'm just here to kind of set the record straight as to diminishing returns don't exactly exist in ESO, and there is a different property that you might be thinking of when you're thinking about diminishing returns in ESO. So here we're going to be just going to first define what diminishing returns are from a gaming perspective. We'll talk about why or how those two sort of definitions, don't exist in ESO. And we'll also talk about the concept that I think people are confusing. There are two concepts I think people are confusing for diminishing returns. So, first of all, the law of diminishing returns is an economics term. So, kind of important to point that out. This term comes from economics. It is not really something that you can put into all fields. It is a mathematical property because economics does kind of cross over into the territory of mathematics. But it is not really something you can necessarily say will fit in like a glove on every single field, particularly for something like gaming. So basically, this is the Wikipedia page for the law of diminishing returns, but it basically states that increasing a factor of production by 1 unit while holding all of these factors constant will at some point return a lower unit of output per incremental unit of input. What that basically means in layman's terms is that for every unit input you get out, at some point, you're going to get out less output. So let's say you have 1 unit of input, you're getting out 1 unit of output. At some threshold, 1 unit of input will yield less than 1 unit of output. They kind of show it here in this graph here, where you're getting a good increase with input, and then the graph starts to level off here, and that's your sort of diminishing returns. And they also have kind of the negative returns, but we don't really want to talk about that too much. Another way to think about this is basically take a look at a logarithmic scale. So here's an idea of what a logarithmic scale looks like. So you have a fairly sharp increase, but it eventually starts to level off and sort of reaches this what's called an asymptote. So this is just sort of a value that your function will never quite reach. It'll get really, really close. Like you'll get like 0.99999, but that's still not technically the value of the asymptote. So that's basically what diminishing returns would look like if you were to graph it out. So for some unit input, you're getting less and less output, but you're never quite hitting that sort of max value here. Well, this is all fine and dandy, but this is just sort of the economics term. This is a basic concept of diminishing returns. What does it mean in terms of gaming? So there's two main ways that diminishing returns shows up in gaming. If you look up definitions of diminishing returns in gaming, you'll see essentially 3 different results. The first one doesn't really apply to what we're talking about. It's basically diminishing returns in graphics. So, getting a better graphics card, you're getting diminishing returns on your graphics output. That's not really, something we're concerned about. But there's 2 other ones that do concern actual gameplay. The first one is soft caps. So, what exactly are soft caps? Well, soft caps are basically some arbitrary value on a stat, let's say max magicka, for example, that the developers put in, where after you hit that point, you can continue to get more of that stat, but it's going to be at a decreased rate. So let's say the soft cap for magicka is 30,000. Once you hit 30,000 max magicka, you can still get more max magicka, but you're getting less than what is advertised. So let's say you hit 30,000 max magicka and you want to include another 1,000 max magicka from an armor bonus. That 1,000 max magicka, because you hit the soft cap already, is going to end up giving you less than that. It's going to give you 750, let's say. That is an example of diminishing returns, because as you get higher and higher above that soft cap, you're getting less and less out of that max magicka that you're trying to put in. That is a good example of diminishing returns. Now, this sort of soft caps no longer exists in ESO. Way back in the day, back in 2015, when ESO first launched, there were soft caps. I remember having to play around with soft caps when I was in the beta and when I first started playing ESO. They were a pain in the ass. And so they decided to remove them in update 6. So soft caps no longer exist in ESO. So, if you want to add in more max magicka, you can do it. Every point of max magicka you're putting in is going to equal 1 point of max magicka that you're getting out. So there are no more soft caps. So this is a very traditional sort of a way that developers introduced this sort of diminishing returns concept in video games, but ESO doesn't have it anymore. The second thing is when you use an ability within a certain time frame, it does less damage or becomes less effective. So for example, let's say you're using Force Pulse and you use it, let's say 3 times in 3 seconds. The first one does 1000 damage, the second one does 900 damage, the third one does 800 damage. You wait 5 seconds, you do Force Pulse again, it goes back up to 1000 damage. That would be an example of diminishing returns in sort of a different sense, in the fact that if you're spamming this overpowered ability, for example, it gets less and less effective. So you're getting, the more input you're putting in this case the input would be ability presses, the less output you're getting out, which in this case would be damage. So that's another way that diminishing returns happens in video games, and obviously in ESO you don't have that. Your first Force Pulse is just going to be just as strong as your second Force Pulse, is just as strong as your third Force Pulse. As long as you aren't changing any stats or anything like that in between the Force Pulses, they'll all do equal damage no matter how quickly or how slowly you are putting those out. So those two forms of diminishing returns don't exist in ESO. There are no soft caps, and your abilities are equally effective no matter how quickly you decide to spam them. So what exactly are people talking about when they talk about diminishing returns in ESO? I have 2 things that I think people might be considering as sort of diminishing returns in ESO. The first one is one that I've used quite a lot on this channel, and it's known as relative change or relative difference. This is basically just a very straightforward math formula where you're taking a look at how much a given input is changing your output from a relative scale. So the big thing here is that it is a relative change. So it basically takes into consideration the size of your initial sort of offering. And I'll explain a little bit more about this. I do have something written up that I'll show you guys in a little bit to kind of further expand upon relative change / relative difference. The other one that I think people are confusing is something called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is not the same thing as diminishing returns. Again, this stems from economics, but unlike the law of diminishing returns, this can be applied across various different fields here. But basically what opportunity cost states is that you are basically taking one thing and you're basically giving up another thing of equal, lesser, or greater value. So a good example of this would be sets. Let's say you want to choose between a set that gives you 500 spell damage or a set that gives you 10% additional crit chance. By taking one set over the other, you are basically introducing an opportunity cost. Your opportunity cost here is 500 spell damage versus 10% crit chance. Now, that is not the same as diminishing returns, obviously, because you're not really getting a change in output for a change in input. You're basically deciding on 2 different inputs for the same output. So that is an example of an opportunity cost, not diminishing returns. And that's something that I think some people get confused about. Just by choosing one set, let's say that 500 spell damage set, that is not a diminishing returns on your damage output. That's just you choosing one set bonus over a second set bonus. That is basically opportunity cost, not diminishing returns. So let's step back a bit and go back to that relative change, relative difference, which I believe is what people are confusing for diminishing returns. So I can see how this is getting confused with diminishing returns. So let's take a look at the mathematical side of things here. So from a math side of things, let's say you have 2 initial damage stats. You have 2000 damage and 3000 damage. So this is your initial stats. So let's say, this is you trying to decide on your, I don't know, a set piece or something like that. And you have to kind of compare and contrast the two. So you're getting a buff that's equal to 200 additional damage. So what is the total amount of increase that you're getting for 200 additional damage on both builds? 2000 initial and 3000 initial. There's 2 possible answers. The first one is that you are getting an absolute increase of 200 spell damage. Pretty straightforward, and that is correct. You are getting 200 spell damage. But that's not really telling you the whole story, because you have to take into consideration the initial value here. 200 compared to 2000 or compared to 3000 are obviously two different comparisons. You're going to want to do the relative change formula, which I've featured many times on this channel. It's the quantity final minus initial divided by your initial value times 100. And so when we decide to do that, what you get out should be two different values. So the first value you get here, avatar froze, it's probably just, it'll come back. But the first value here is based on the 2000, you get a 10% relative increase. The second value is based on the 3000, which gives you a 6.7% relative increase. So, obviously, with the additional 200 base damage, you're getting a smaller relative increase for the 3000 initial compared to the 2000 initial. This is not the same thing as diminishing returns. Let me repeat that. That is not the same thing as diminishing returns. Why is this? Well, diminishing returns basically states that for every input you get, you're getting less and less output. If we take a look at the absolute side of things, if diminishing returns was happening in ESO, for every point of spell damage you put in, you will be getting less spell damage out for the higher spell damage you get, which is not the case. Regardless of whether you have 1000, 2000, 3000, 5000 spell damage, 200 spell damage added onto that is always going to be 200 spell damage. If you take a look at effective spell damage, where you're also taking consideration Max Magicka, for example, it's still a absolute increase of 200 spell damage. So from an absolute standpoint, no, this is not diminishing returns. You're getting tit for tat here. You're getting 1 for 1. Now, on a relative increase here, so the relative change, I can see where people are getting confused here, where they might think this is called diminishing returns. But in reality, it's less diminishing returns, more of a smaller relative increase. And these are arguably different things here. So again, going back to the definition of diminishing returns. For every unit input you get, you're getting less unit output. So it really depends on what you're defining as input and output here. So in this example, if you're defining input as spell damage and defining output as damage done, then in some sense, yes, you are getting less relative damage out, but it's not really the same thing here. The difference here is that relative change is basically is a unitless measurement. There are no units attached to percentages. It's just 10%, 5%, 6%, whatever. Diminishing returns, you do have to deal with this sort of unit, so to speak. So like your output unit, for example, might be something like DPS. Or in your input might be something like spell damage. But for relative change, you're not really dealing with units here. It's just a number, basically. But I can kind of see where the confusion comes in, because it does seem like as you get higher and higher initial starting values, the same amount of damage that you're getting in gets you less relative increase. But that's just a property of just using bigger initial values. It's not necessarily a property of like the game itself. It's not a property of... It's not a game mechanic, basically. It's just the result of having bigger numbers, essentially. You know, 10% off of $5,000 is going to be greater than 10% off of $500. That's just the just the natural order of things. That's just a property of starting with 5,000 versus 500. So it's not really a property of diminishing returns in so much as it's just a natural phenomenon that's happening here. So diminishing returns, it doesn't really exist in ESO. What you're seeing is basically just a natural phenomenon that happens because you're looking at large values, large numbers, and you're basically continuing to add to those numbers, so your numbers just keep getting larger and larger. So the relative increase you're seeing is getting smaller and smaller, but that's not really the same thing as diminishing returns. That's just the natural property of you're taking a percentage of a larger and larger number, essentially. No matter what happens, regardless of whether, what other mechanics there are, this is always going to happen. Even in games with soft cap. Soft cap basically just exacerbates this issue, basically by introducing that soft cap. The diminishing returns basically exacerbates this issue. So basically, diminishing returns, they don't exist in ESO. At least not in the traditional sense that you think of in terms of gaming. There's no soft caps. You don't get diminishing returns on damage abilities the more you spam them. So, yeah. the people who are saying that are diminishing returns in ESO, they might be confusing it with something like relative change or opportunity cost, but they're not really describing diminishing returns in a traditional sense here. The only times diminishing returns were a thing in ESO were back when we had soft caps in the start of the game, and also back before the CP changes. So CP 1.0, there was diminishing returns on CPs where you would need to put more CPs to get to the next percentage point, the next jump point. Those were the only two instances of diminishing returns in ESO. And I would argue that the CP eventually became less of a diminishing returns issue and more of an opportunity cost, because CPs were capped at 100 points per node. So at that point, it was basically a opportunity cost, or basically an optimization problem, essentially. There were still diminishing returns if you just wanted to optimize into one node, but it's not really a thing anymore. Not in ESO as it is right now in CP 2.0. But yeah, that pretty much covers it for this video. Make sure to check out the other videos describing other common misconceptions and other core mechanics in ESO. But that's it for me. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys later.